Hello, good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing Ali Rad Yousefnia. Um, when I first started to talk with Ali about South Asian modernisms, we thought one of the ways he and I could contribute was um, by doing these solo videos and collating these videos along with all the others that are online and putting forward our point of view. But we thought it would be better if we both collaborated and we did a conversation of sorts. So, Ali, uh, would you like to introduce yourself to the people on camera?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. It's my privilege to be part of the South Asian Modernism webinar and also the working group. We have the fantastic opportunity to have the exhibition here in Brisbane, and the exhibition will be there for 1 week. And I highly encourage everyone to come and visit if you haven't. And if you just scan the QR code and you reach to the video, we really like to hear your thoughts about the images and also the journey that you went through in the exhibition.
Great. So, Ali has specific interests. He's done a lot of research in urbanism across the Middle East, across the pre-modern Persian world. So, my question to Ali, really, a starting question, would really be Ali, given the fact that you concentrate on Middle Eastern histories and pre-modern Persianate histories, as you call them, how does this in some ways overlap with your interest now in South Asian modernisms?
Excellent, great question. So, if I want to go back into my passion and also interest in knowing the area that we know as South Asia, and considering the place that I'm coming from, and also it was like part of my bigger research, which we can call it West Asia or so called Middle East, there are lots of great exchange happening between uh, great dynasties and also a lot of exchange happening in terms of religion, in terms of culture, language, and lots of cultural heritage, let's say. But we start to realize these exchanges never reflected into architectural education. And specifically looking at education in terms of history and theory, South Asia itself is absent. Nevertheless, talking about the modernism in South Asia. And thinking a lot about these attributes and also questions in my mind, I realized there is a huge gap from the education taking place in the places called as so-called Middle East and also Western Asia, that it never reflected the realities in the world. And these are coming from the imaginative worlds of the Eurocentric, Western-oriented curriculum and academia showing itself in these fields and in these places.
Great, thanks, Ali. So tell us about the commonalities. Tell us about what the agents of change were in the Middle East and how did they, in some ways, compare with the agents of change in South Asia in terms of education, in terms of the way in which education was offered to the masses, in terms of the way in which, for example, the scholarship of education reached out to the masses in a right or a wrong way. I mean, in South Asia, we often talk about Bannister Fletcher. Is there something equivalent in the Middle East, for instance?
Excellent, great question. I think we have to really look at the origins and also the references of colonialism in these two different geographies, because both places went through different imperial slash colonial experiences. Looking at South Asian contexts that have been colonized under imperial this British Empire, and when we look at Turkey or Iran, modern day Turkey or Iran, they have a slightly different experience. And I'm trying to be cautious about talking about these discussions because everyone starts to talk about some contexts that have never been colonized and being, let's say, being proud of it or thinking it as like a uniqueness in a like a good term. But during my research, I started to realize no one was immune from these mechanisms, and we can start to see micro imperialisms and like a micro colonialism apparatuses starting to show up in these geographies. Not saying that they did follow the exact pathways, but again, if we want to connect it to architectural education and also history and theory and the way it had been taught, there's kind of a fascination with the West. And because the origins and the references of all materials are going back to the Western oriented Eurocentric discussions, even if someone wants to look at Indian subcontinent, or if someone wants to look at the Central Asia, they'll turn their faces to the Westerners to get the materials from there. And that's creating, again, another biased colonial and also Orientalist views in South Asia. Nevertheless, mentioning that when you look at both geographies, they're just like side by side. But I cannot imagine geographies and also countries and cultures that being this much close to each other, but also at the same time being this much away from each other, that they don't understand anything when they look at the history and also theory and also the context. And as far as I understood, it's also same when it comes to South Asian context, that if someone wants to look at the Western Asia, again, the reference is going back to the Western sources rather than looking at the context itself or looking for alternatives.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. So, before going further, I'd like to question one particular term that you've been using, and we have all been using, and in fact, the MoMA exhibition used modernism, modernity, and the reason I'm bringing up that term is because I've always been perplexed as to what it really means to different places. Now, in terms of Asia, in terms of the Indian subcontinent, we realize that modernity, nascent modernity, began with the independence of India in 1947, and large parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia experienced a neoliberalism by the 1980s, by the 90s. And this modernity, the spirit of modernity, got translated into the making of buildings, into the physical expression on the building in terms of the dressage or the way the buildings were put together and how they looked. Now, a similar modernity did not happen in many parts of the Middle East. And for instance, it did not happen in Iran. But still, there was a modernity of sorts in Iran. So, can you tell us a little bit about, maybe comparatively or otherwise, about the modernity in the Middle East
Yeah.
that in some ways was comparative to or was different from the kind of modernity in Asia proper?
Yeah, excellent question. I think when we look at the context specifically and looking at the modern day Iran and modern day Turkey, and probably many other places that started to become as like independent and not probably as heavily as influences like the South Asia in terms of the colonialism, we have a post-colonial period in India that they're looking at their identity through the lens of people like Gandhi and people that are creating a self-reflection in terms of freeing them and becoming emancipated from those heavier influences under the British rule. But when we look at Iran, again, Turkey, and many other countries that they started to become independent, the most important essence over there is nationalism. And they're tying the nationalism with architecture. And nationalist kind of motivators are creating a different language in architecture that, again, when we look at the contributors over there, we see that they're going to schools in France, learning from them, creating like standardization of like architecture, creating only facade elements, like more of a like a 1700 1800 French architecture with people like Durand and architects in that period. And it's all tied to some discourses that are heavily influenced and biased in terms of nationalism, in terms of local kind of influences by the larger players in the game. For example, they assigned Louis Khan to build several buildings in India, but there's not that much of like Louis Khan touch in Iran, except that he came to a conference in Iran, and unfortunately after that he passed away. But again, when we look at the big players, many places were quick enough to get those star architects of their time, and people like Corp or Louis Khan, or they started to introduce and create from that capitalistic environments that many people like Charles Correa started to show up um, in those contexts. But again, what we have in Iranian or like Turkish context are that not many of them are having that pure language that can come up from local buildings or local knowledge. It's kind of a transfer of knowledge that I think that one needs to be deconstructed and decolonized as well. Because if we start to appreciate the things that they've been doing for years, yes, there are great buildings, but how much of it is like related to the context that they grew up like, or they're creating these architectural artifacts is the question.
So then, sort of following up on what you just said, what does modernity, or what does modernism, or what does being modern mean to the contemporary Iranian architect, for instance? Does it mean making a building in new material? Does it making a building where the programmatic elements, the formal spatial elements are different? Does it making a building in a way that best suits the context and the culture and the spirit of the place? What is being modern? What does that mean to the contemporary Iranian architect?
It's a very big question that I think I won't be able to unpack it in like one answer. But always Frederick Jameson's sentences and also discussions strike me, saying that the first use of the term itself, like the modern or modernist, goes back to the 8th century, and understanding like what does it mean and trying to contextualizing it to what we have today is, I think, would be can be like a PhD thesis to see what is modernism or what was modernity in Iran, or did we have any? So looking at brute beton or like creating with brutalist elements that many architects did, we will have lots of examples that we can talk. If we look at the Turkish case, in Iran, it's always tied to, again, that necessity and also the urge to finding origins. And whatever you see is heavily politicized or created some kind of bonds with the history and also elements that are getting visual references for the architect's buildings, which created a different language. If you look at the buildings of Amanat, Seyhun, Furughi, there are lots of elements that are creating a new language of modernism that you may not be able to see. For example, if you look at Farman Farman's like buildings, there are so many beautifully crafted lapis lazuli tiles, and there are so many different elements that you won't be able to see in different modernisms. That is again creating this question is like, so what were the agency of modernism? In India, it was Nehru's vision to creating a new nation out of concrete beton and technology and dams and all these mega projects. When you look at it in Iran, it's interesting. I saw some video footages of Iran's previous prince getting married to the princess of Egypt, and they're using all these visual references of past of the Achaemenids and also ancient Egypt to say that we had an empire and we had like a great grandiose architectural elements and things like that. But I think Iran never came up to that kind of a self-realization, and there's a huge gap, an identical crisis, that when you go to Iranian cities, you see a lot of Romanesque architecture and Greek elements in the cities, which is again creating this question why. And I think the question's answer is in the education, that it's again very Western oriented, and also it's very Eurocentric.
Yeah. So whatever I'm understanding is that the education is does not create enough capacity in the students to actually interrogate themselves about what is it to be modern, and how is it to be modern in terms of their buildings, in terms of their architecture. And in fact, this is also an issue that comes up in India, in many parts of South Asia, where students in architecture school, they actually study primers in construction, and they study books that have very little to do with the way in which buildings are built in their context and place. I, for example, when I studied architecture at a really good school, I was given building construction manuals that were from that actually talked about early 20th century construction, and late 19th century construction in wood and brick, which had very little relevance to how masons in my time built buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling that that's exactly what is also the case in many other parts of the world, especially the Middle East, where there is a schism, there's almost a split between what you are taught and how you practice.
Yeah.
So, in fact, there's a big difference. So, now tell me, just to conclude, what do you think are the implications of this kind of modernism? How do these how do these modernisms that are in the hands of people who are not exactly up to speed in terms of interpreting them, in terms of using them, in terms of being mature about formulating them and endorsing them on the body of their buildings, what are the implications of these modernisms?
Of which modernisms that like
The modernisms that, for instance, are practiced by several architects across South Asia, which are in some ways sort of half-hearted modernisms,
Mm-hmm.
um, and in many parts of the Middle East, which are half-hearted modernisms. So, what are the implications of that? Of course, one way is to look at this is through, for example, the MoMA exhibition that happened, which actually celebrated great examples of signature modernism. These great buildings that are beautiful to look at, beautiful concrete work, beautiful form work, and so forth. But I believe, and I think we all believe, there are many other kinds of modernisms as well that prevail alongside this so called heroic modernism.
Mm-hmm.
And they have as much a role to play in the way we talk about our own identities being formulated and reformulated.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think when we look at the buildings photographed and also uh, showcased in this exhibition, they are the ones that creating this like mega effect. When you look at the modernism and you look at the context and you say how it's possible to have such a thing over here. But if you ask me, I think the real effect came from those buildings, not the ones that have like that kind of like a half-heart modernisms and trying to adapt things in the region and the local discussions. Having said that, I'm not saying we should devalue one or like put an extra value on the other one, but they were also smart buildings. Maybe they didn't have that much of effect, but they found their way to survive. But when you look at these buildings, they are getting the highest level of attacks, and also the demolition proposals and things like that, with the Hall of Nation, for example, in India, that have been demolished. If you ask me, there are millions of examples that we can look at in Western Asia or like so-called Middle East that are under threat of demolition. And I'm not exaggerating saying millions, because when you look at all these different countries, there will be lots of buildings that are turning into ordinary buildings and getting demolished. And it only takes to being tied to an organization or like a big name that this thing can happen and that the building can survive. But to conclude, when I look back at the education system and also things that we went through, probably a student in Iranian educational system studying architecture would be know the styles, and not only styles, they'll also know the contemporary implications of uh, deconstructivism, foldism, and all these new isms that introduced by um, some biased knowledge, let's say, and just leave it over there, that um, they're also tied to like certain institutions. Any student will know those discussions well enough. And if you ask the same student, so let's talk about the close history and let's talk about 1800, 1900 and how things happened in your context, probably they wouldn't have kind of adequate answers for these questions. So I think what we're doing with GHTC and also trying to deconstruct and also decolonize the knowledge would be the highest level of implication that is gonna show itself in the close future in the architectural history and theory teaching. And I'm pretty sure exhibitions like South Asian modernisms are the ones to show that there are always alternatives, and Corp did not design only in Europe and in the US. And in fact, he only had one building in the North American context, but he was the patron of so many projects in the Western Asia, and he completely built a city from scratch with the help of Pierre Jean Rey and other people in post-colonial India. Reminder that the case of Iran and also the case of Turkey is full of military coups. There are lots of military coups happened. There are revolutions, there are wars, and unfortunately, the most vulnerable places and the most vulnerable context in this situation is architecture and also the buildings that are not having, let's say, a UNESCO heritage site kind of stamp on it. So these are the places that completely demolished during the wars, during the coups, or during the government's changing hand.
So so a lot of modern architecture was a lot of, one would say, hybridized architecture that effectively experimented with these ways of thinking, was like collateral to these coups, to these armed aggressions.
Yes, and they were kind of targets.
Yeah.
So many buildings that have been built, demolished because many of them were like sponsored by the state, or they had lots of state implications or connections and things like that. And because the building doesn't have any custodians after the people are leaving,
Yeah.
they're just like open to, they're very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And no one is taking any responsibility, which same happened, for example, in the case of Iran, when a new dynasty started in 1925. They felt like they need to erase everything that was in the close past. They didn't see any value to keeping those buildings and the built environment. So it's a story of like war and destruction, and also how all these like processes interrupted.
Excellent, very good. So this has been a wonderful discussion, as you can see, and we can continue to talk. But I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered ground in terms of what education does and how it happens and how it is a challenge in many of the nations that we represent, in terms of our group, in terms of our concentration on the built environment. So I will leave it at that, and I will thank Ali
Thank you.
wholeheartedly for his participation, and I look forward to future discussions with the other people watching this video and the other videos that are part of this series. Thank you.
Thank you.